Welcome to Animals in the Environment. I'm Tina Beth Pena, and today we're at the Alley Pond Environmental Center in Queens. Since 1970, we've celebrated Earth Day each April. It's a chance to reflect on the unique environmental changes we face and a chance to do something about them. In this half hour, we'll focus on the role animals play in our world, why we need them, why they need us, and how we can all live together. From the largest of sea creatures to the smallest, from bees, birds, and bears in our backyards to coyotes on our city streets. We begin with our oceans and the spectacular whales that inhabit them, and why we need to protect these amazing creatures. Vianora Vinca has their story.
Why we should care. Because it's not about hugging whales and dolphins, as much as that's a lovely thing to think about. It's about ourselves and our very own existence on this planet.
Grandson of legendary ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau, Fabien Cousteau is continuing his grandfather's work of raising awareness about our planet's ocean habitat. He explains whales are critical for the function of our oceans.
They keep nature in balance, and without them, it's like knocking a peg off of a stack of Jenga blocks. The more pegs you knock off, the more imbalanced the tower is, and eventually it'll crumble.
Our own CUNY professor Dr. Elizabeth Alter points out that whales stabilize the ocean food chain by consuming large amounts of krill and fish. Aside from the predator role, there are other, less obvious roles by which whales benefit the underseas.
Gray whales feed by scooping up big mouthfuls of the ocean bottom. And in the process, they turn over sediment, they turn over carbon, they turn over marine creatures that are living in that sediment, and they bring all of those nutrients and organisms up from the bottom for other marine animals to eat.
Scientists at Harvard and the University of Vermont have recently found that whales also help ocean ecology with their nutrient-rich waste.
As mammals, whales must come to the surface to breathe, and when they do, they often excrete as well. So their feces ends up in surface waters where it acts as a rich source of nutrients, essentially fertilizing surface waters that would not otherwise have those nutrients.
When whales die, they either sink to the ocean bottom where they're colonized by an array of sea creatures. Some only specialize in whalebone, as Dr. Alter told us, or they drift ashore, where all their biomass is consumed by terrestrial organisms.
An isotopic study that was done a few years ago showed that California condors in the past fed largely on the carcasses of baleen whales that washed ashore. And the isotopes from current California condors today show that they're feeding primarily at cattle feedlots. It means that the loss of whales not only affects ocean ecosystems, but in this case may have contributed to the decline of the California condor, a terrestrial bird.
Beached whales give scientists significant clues into the impact that the ocean environment has on the marine mammals. The whale's fatty tissues, like the blubber, and most recently the earwax, contain a clear record of the contaminants that may have accumulated in the animal's body. As each layer of earwax corresponds to 6 months of a whale's life, scientists can figure out not only what and how much of the environmental contaminant the whale has been exposed to, but also when.
When we take tissue samples or earwax plugs or what have you to learn about an animal, we're learning how our influences, our activities are influencing that animal, but not just that animal, ourselves, because now we're starting to compare not only cognitive behavior, physical influences, and so on and so forth of that animal, we're also relating it back to what's happening to our own bodies, to our own ecosystem on land.
To monitor the health of whales in the wild, researchers collect samples from their breath using small remote-controlled helicopters. The breath reveals stress hormone levels as well as diseases that the whales may carry. Tags are sometimes placed on whales to determine their migratory patterns as related to the global climate.
In the case of gray whales, we had 2 individuals now that have shown up in the Atlantic. So the gray whale is a Pacific species currently, found only in the Pacific. So researchers have been very surprised to find the presence of gray whales in the Atlantic and have attributed it to the loss of seasonal sea ice, allowing whales to travel across the Arctic Circle.
While the loss of ice over the oceans and the fluctuations of temperatures on land have become a common mainstream narrative, Fabien Cousteau warns that the temperature variations in the underseas have a lasting impact.
In the oceans, those variations happen much, much more slowly. But once they happen, they stay with us for a much longer period of time. And that's a big problem for upwellings, for migratory patterns, for animals that are sensitive to that, for coral reef systems, which are the underwater cities. All those things, when they are affected for years, for decades, for hundreds, if not thousands of years to come.
Vianora Vinca for CUNY TV.
Your first encounter with a horseshoe crab may have been at a sandy beach when you were a kid. These tiny creatures, however, are not only important to the environment, but also for our health. Now they're in danger and they need our help. Maggie Leguera-Wilkinson reports.
Horseshoe crabs are related to spider families. They're not crabs at all. They do not bite, they do not stab.
Dr. Martin Schreibman has been studying horseshoe crabs for years and is working to protect what is an often very misunderstood creature.
There are horseshoe crab species in the east, southeast, Asia, and those are really in trouble. They're dwindling almost down to very dangerous levels. We don't want to see that happen here with the Atlantic horseshoe crab. So we're trying to understand their population dynamics, where they're going, how we can protect them, so that we do maintain a healthy colony of horseshoe crabs. One of the early goals of our facility was for restoration. Our idea was to bring in the horseshoe crab fertilized eggs, grow them up to acceptable size, and then release them into the environment. They have like 10 pairs of eyes. So there's eyes all over the body. They're fascinating animals. They're different looking. They're very old. They're very ancient, almost as ancient as I am. They're 420 million years old.
And to lose these oddly shaped creatures would be to lose a vital link in the ecosystem of the Atlantic seaboard.
The birds that are on a south-north migration can never complete that migration up into Canada and Maine and north of that without stopping for some kind of food along the way. Sort of like taking the kids on a trip and stopping at McDonald's, otherwise they'd never make it. So they stop and they feed on the eggs. So we have all of these hundreds, thousands of horseshoe crabs along the coast that are mating at the same time, depositing their eggs, and there is a very dramatic feeding frenzy when these eggs are there. If you go down to the shore, it's mating horseshoe crabs, and even while they're there and afterwards even more, you find the birds just swarming down on it to feed on these horseshoe crabs.
And birds aren't the only things whose health depends on the horseshoe crab. Since 1970, medical science has used a compound only found in horseshoe crabs as a primary method for testing drug and equipment sterility.
The other important role is that they produce something in their blood called LAL, limulus amoebocyte lysate. They have blue blood, and it's the only animal that produces LAL. And it's very important in the pharmaceutical industry. The blood is capable of detecting pathogenic bacteria. There's no other test for it now. Even in our finest chemists have not been able to come up with something that will replace the amoebocyte, the LAL from horseshoe crabs. The other thing that horseshoe crabs have been abused for, I would say, is fertilizer. I mean, just sticking them in the ground and using them for fertilizer in planting beds, or using them to bait traps for eels or whelk. That hasn't been under regulation. As a result, we've had problems with dwindling populations of the Atlantic horseshoe crab.
And while pharmaceutical companies have certainly over-harvested horseshoe crabs for their blood, commercial harvesting has taken its toll on them as well.
What are horseshoe crabs used for?
Horseshoe crabs, they get chopped up and they get put in eel traps. Eels are what we use to catch our striped bass. They're also used to catch conch, and they're also used to catch whelk. Where they were, 100 years ago compared to where they are now, it's probably 25% of where they were, just from over-harvesting. That's where most of the population went. Like even in the 1920s, there was tremendous over-harvesting. They were using them for, fertilizer, and they were using them in cattle feed.
For everything?
For everything. They were just another, garbage fish of the ocean.
In recent years, the horseshoe crab has caught a break, as state laws have set out to regulate harvesting practices along the Atlantic coast.
In New Jersey, there's a moratorium going on right now where they are not allowed to catch any of them. In New York State, they're only allowed 5 per day. Or when it comes to eel fishing, they did reduce it, and they actually created another formula for bait that they only use 10% of what they were actually using before that.
And with dedicated scientists like Professor Schreibman and his colleagues as stewards, the future of the Atlantic horseshoe crab may no longer be as dire.
We have adequate conservation policies in place, about taking animals without reason, without regulation, and those are the policies we have to develop and adhere to.
The horseshoe crab has navigated the Earth's shorelines for hundreds of millions of years. And while you may not notice one during your walk on the beach, we should probably make sure that these living fossils don't become just, well, fossils. I'm Magali Laguerre-Wilkinson for CUNY TV.
I think we should care about animals because we are one. And there is no separation. We are human beings. We are one kind of species. But if we are awake, alive, and alert to the world around us, animals are part of our surroundings. In New York City, one only has to go to Central Park to see the migration of warblers in the spring and fall. There are coyotes here. When you think about the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean, it is a sea of fish and mammals.
Most of us think of bees as a summertime nuisance, but in reality, they make it possible for our favorite foods to reach our tables. But they're facing a growing man-made danger every day. Mike Gilliam has that story.
There's a worldwide honeybee crisis that could affect all of us and our food supply. And to learn more about it, we've come to a very unlikely spot, a terrace here at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel on Park Avenue in Midtown Manhattan.
We are raising honeybees right here in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. We are creating honey that the Waldorf Astoria uses for their signature dishes, trying to give something to the environment while at the same time we take a little sweet nectar for ourselves.
But there is a problem that could wreak havoc on our food chain. The honeybee population across the globe has been decreasing dramatically in recent years.
We commonly refer to this phenomena as colony collapse disorder, or CCD. And that's where there's mass die-offs of honeybees. It would decimate the farming industry because of all of the different foods that are pollinated by honeybees. Blueberries, cranberries, oranges. I mean, there's just a list as long as your arm of foods that count on commercial pollination of honeybees.
Christine Johnson is an entomology expert at the Museum of Natural History.
About 75% of our food is pollinated by bees. There are native pollinators, native bees that pollinate plants, as well as some flies and butterflies, but because of human encroachment on their habitat, there really aren't enough of these native pollinators to cover all the pollination that we need.
So what's actually happening with the honeybees? Why are they dying?
Colony collapse disorder is a disorder. It's not a single disease. It seems to be a result of 3 factors. So the bees being exposed to their normal parasites and viruses and bacteria and mites, also their exposure to pesticides and fungicides that are used on crops, as well as their being relatively homogenized and not having the genetic variation needed to perhaps combat all these factors.
And the more bees are bred for specific traits, the less variation the population has, and the more homogenized they become. And that can spell trouble for a species.
So there's not the genetic variation so that some individuals might survive, whereas others don't survive. Instead, you have the majority of the colony having the same type of genotype and phenotype, so they're susceptible, all of them die, versus having some that maybe have a different genotype with a different phenotype that can survive and continue on.
So, dedicated, experienced beekeepers work meticulously to keep their populations in check.
When we think about bees, we think of them in wide open meadows, that sort of thing, but
Yeah.
You're on the roof here of the Waldorf. How does that work in a city like this? I mean, we're surrounded by skyscrapers.
We are, but the truth is those bees can fly for up to 3 miles in any direction. So they make a beeline for Central Park, and there they've got almost 1,000 acres of forage. And they go up and down Park Avenue, and they take the nectar from all the flowers on the linden trees, and they just find every community garden and every tree, and they bring the nectar back, and they do quite well.
And now these hives would be moved from crop to crop?
Well, I mean, in this particular case, we don't move these hives, but yes, this type of hive would be moved from crop to crop in order to pollinate the different crops. So, for example, 300 hives will fit onto the back of a tractor trailer, and they'll be taken from farm to farm in order to pollinate different crops.
It is this mass commercial farming cycle where some think the problems begin.
In the beginning of the year, it all begins with almonds. About half of all of the honeybees in the United States are freighted to California, where they're on a steady diet for 6 weeks of almond nectar. Then, having only had one source of food, this monocrop, for so long, they're a bit weaker.
I think the lessons are that we need to increase our diversity, or to maintain diversity in our crops and our pollinators, so that we don't get this massive attack on a species or a number of species because we've modified or we've reduced the variation so much in the crops and the insects.
I think honeybees are misunderstood. I think that they're lumped together with other types of bees and wasps and hornets. The honeybee is a docile, calm, beautiful creature that carries honey back to the hive for us, and they do a great deal of good for humans.
But one thing is certain, if we save the honeybees, we do a lot to help ourselves and our food supply. I'm Mike Gilliam for CUNY TV.
Most of us have been aware of a change we never thought we'd see. Coyotes settling in the Bronx, deer throughout the tri-state area, and bears just hanging out in our backyards. So why are these almost unimaginable events happening? And how can we learn to coexist with the very animals we need as an important part of our environment?
Populations of everything are increasing, whether it be bear, deer, coyotes. The biggest challenge is managing the people and helping them understand what the best thing to do for everybody is.
Coexisting with any wild animal is a necessary part of our environment. Take coyotes. They are critical in the food chain. They eat rodents, rabbits, and other natural prey every year. A recent study by the CUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry estimates that during the summer, there are more than 14,000 breeding pairs of coyotes in New York. In fact, coyotes now inhabit almost every state in the country. They're smart and can easily adapt to human environments, and that's both good and bad.
Over the last 150, 200 years, they've been moving their way east, largely in response to the fact that there is no other top predator in the Northeast. We used to have cougars, or mountain lions. We used to have the eastern wolf, and because of us, we don't have those anymore. So nature really does abhor a vacuum. The other thing is there's potential benefits for living with a predator like the coyote. They may help to regulate the deer population. They may help to regulate the rodent population. And if people are aware of coyotes, there truly is very little risk living around coyotes if we keep them wild, if we don't feed them.
Black bears also play an important role in healthy environments. When they forage for food, not only do they clear small amounts of vegetation, opening up space for additional plants to grow, they also feed on fruits and berries, ultimately spreading the seeds of many different plants. Conservation efforts for controlling black bears have been effective, but the key to successful coexistence between people and bears is a healthy respect for one another and each other's habitats.
Human population is still growing, expanding, moving into new territories that were once wild. Because of that, we have a population of bears and deer and geese that's, living in constant contact with these people. And I don't believe you're going to find a scenario anywhere else in the country where you have a density of black bears like we have here in New Jersey. If you're going to make a conscious decision to come live in an area where there's wildlife, then yes, there's going to be certain concessions on your part. You're going to have to learn to maybe not do some of the things that you did where you lived where those animals weren't. In the case of black bears, you you can't leave food outside. If you do those things and the animal comes into your yard and gets into that stuff, you can't really blame the animal. It doesn't know any better. It's trying to survive. It's doing the same thing the rest of us are doing.
New Jersey has actively managed its black bear population since 1953 through education, conservation, and hunting.
Prior to our hunting season, we had bears breaking into houses, upwards of 100 instances a year, where bears were physically inside the house. Now that we've instituted the bear season, that's less than 30 a year. We want people to enjoy them, to see them, to photograph them, to hunt them, to truly appreciate them for generations to come.
Although deer help sustain our environment as well with a plant-based diet, they also pose the greatest threat to forests in the eastern United States due to their increasing numbers.
Deer are these organisms that really love patchy, edgy environments. There's a lot of good food at the edge. There's a lot of places to retreat deep in the woods for cover and shelter. Staten Island is unfortunately primo deer habitat because we don't have hunting, we don't have cougars, we don't have wolves, and we have edge habitat. So the deer population will grow to quite high levels unchecked in that kind of circumstance. So most foresters believe that when the deer population exceeds 10, 12, 15 deer per square mile, the forest is negatively impacted. And what we mean by that is the deer will begin to eat the understory. So what happens is the forest, you lose biodiversity. You're losing young plants, you're losing wildflowers. And in New York City, where we have such few parkland, it's really a shame to lose all that biodiversity. You can't get it back.
Peaceful coexistence and controlling the wildlife among us is one way to keep our environment healthy. And we can learn a lot from each other.
These animals, at the very least, have learned to adapt with the biggest nuisance of species out there, which is us. And we can probably learn a lot from understanding how they've adapted to urban environments. Because again, it's not the wildlife of 42nd Street. It's the New York City coyote or deer that's hanging out in the remnant wooded spaces we still have, just on a much smaller scale.
If we take environment out of our vocabulary and maybe insert home, perhaps we will begin to listen to one another. Perhaps we will begin to find that common ground that transcends politics, where we can really focus on what creates a thriving, healthy home. And maybe health is a connective tissue. If we have a healthy environment, then we have human beings, we have birds, we have plants, we have an array of life.
I'm Donna Hanover. Birds are among the most important creatures when it comes to protecting our environment. They play key but often overlooked roles.
The Irish poet Robert Lind had this observation on birds. There is nothing in which birds differ more from man than the way in which they can build and yet leave the landscape as it was before. So how do birds fit into our landscape? David Lottie is an assistant professor of biology at Queen's College. He says birds are key players in the overall health of our natural world. We met in his laboratory, which also serves as a research library.
Birds are a predominant member of most ecosystems in the world, and as members of those ecosystems, they interact with all the other plants and animals, and so their interactions are part of what make those other animals and plants what they are.
Professor Lottie says that of the 10,000 species of birds worldwide, in New York, some 200 to 300 species play an important role in nature's machine.
Birds' diet especially helps the environment because, for instance, they keep insect levels down, they keep vegetation levels down in ponds, they eat things that would otherwise grow, their populations would grow out of whack.
Growing out of whack is a good way to describe a fast-growing water-based troublemaker known as milfoil.
Milfoil is an invasive plant, a weed that has invaded many of the ponds and lakes of New England and the northeastern United States. And it is threatening a lot of the fish life that are associated with lakes that are low nutrient load.
Milfoil can also clog reservoirs, but here's where the lake birds come in. They love it, and by eating milfoil, they keep the water cleaner and healthier.
Are birds also important to pollination?
Hummingbirds in our area are well known to pollinate the flowers because they eat the nectar and the pollen brushes off on them, and then they transfer the pollen to other plants.
What would happen to the environment if all the birds just went away? I don't mean flew south for the winter. What if they just disappeared? What would happen to the environment?
I think the first thing that we would notice is vast overpopulation of insects. The insects that we prefer not to have to deal with, especially like mosquitoes and certain moths whose caterpillars decimate our trees, would grow to tremendous proportions.
Some folks make serious work out of studying birds in all sorts of weather. Earlier this year, I joined with bird enthusiasts in the snowy wonderland of Brooklyn's Prospect Park.
We're seeing all the waterfowl mostly that has come down from Canada, and they spend the winter down here. We've got a lot of Canada geese. We have black ducks, we have mallards, we have a few ruddy ducks.
I was amazed at the sheer number and variety of feathered wildlife in just this one city park.
And then out on the ice a little bit further out, you can see about 1,000 gulls right now. Yesterday there were about 2,000.
How many species of birds do you do a count out here?
An average on a year, we get 196 species.
Species are always adapting and always evolving in certain ways. And for example, song sparrow is a species of bird, but depending on different part of the country, it can have a different color sort of combination. It can be darker in the Pacific Northwest or lighter further south. So some birds are starting to evolve. There have been studies showing that they're evolving slightly different color morphs due to the human environmental issues.
Do you worry about that? Do you worry about the impact of human activity on the birds?
We try to understand and then find if there are ways that we can mitigate or, somehow work to preserve areas of land that are refuges for birds and so on.
Bird Club members maintain protected feeding areas in this park where wild birds can eat and thrive.
Here's the chickadee,
which is really cool.
Whether it's a chestnut-sided warbler, a mute swan, a northern shoveler, or a yellow-bellied sapsucker, we're all in this world together, and it's good to share it wisely.
Birds are remarkably important to most ecosystems because they eat parasites that harm trees, eat vegetation that harms our water, pollinate plants, spread the seeds of plants, even spread animal life. They are vital to the environment. I'm Donna Hanover for CUNY TV.
That's our show for today. For more information on any of our stories, log on to our website at cuny.tv. I'm Tina Beth Pina for Animals and the Environment.